The scariest game I've ever played is this adaptation of Jurassic Park for the Super Nintendo. I have very distinct memories of playing this game when I was young and hating how uneasy, nervous, and isolated it made me feel. I had no idea where to go, what to do, how to escape from this dinosaur-infested island, and for some reason, this elevator was so creepy to me. The crazy part is, I didn't even own this game, and as far as I know, I probably rented it one time on a whim and never played it again. But still to this day, I have these vivid memories of it. At least, I thought I did. Until I searched up some footage of the game during the beginning phases of scripting this video, and it wasn't quite how I remembered it. This game doesn't look scary, at least it doesn't look like it's intentionally trying to frighten the player. And outside of these bizarre first-person indoor areas and this creepy-ass elevator, it doesn't really even tap into the terrifying atmosphere that the blockbuster film was known for. Now, it's common, obviously, for our memories to warp and fade in different ways the further and further away we get from the events that created them. But what I realized when watching the footage of Jurassic Park is that I wasn't necessarily remembering the game itself. How it played, the layout of the areas, even how it looked in some cases. I was remembering the emotions that it made me feel. The details of the game were fuzzy, but the form of fear that I experienced playing it still vibrantly stuck to my brain. It's no surprise that memories with strong emotions attached to them stick with us longer and impact us to a greater degree than run-of-the-mill everyday occurrences. And fear is one of the most powerful emotions we have. This is one of the things that makes horror games so interesting. Their ability and intent to create a strong emotional attachment between the player and the game can rival the most compelling stories, the most likable characters, and the most engaging states of flow found in other games. But the problem horror games run into is, not everyone is scared by them. Fear is a universal emotion, but being scared by a game exists on varying levels depending on who's playing it. No matter how horrifying a situation a game may present, there still exists a clear disconnect between game and real life. And if this disconnect is too apparent to a player, it can be extremely difficult to actually trigger a response of fear. Tell me if you've had this experience while playing a horror game before. You're slowly walking down a dimly lit hallway with seemingly nothing at the other end when all of a sudden a shadowy figure scampers across the hall or a door slams loudly in front of you. Regardless of whether or not you were startled by this moment, how do you react after it happens? The reaction you're intended to have is one of fear. You stop in your tracks, you wonder what the hell that was, you gather your wits before slowly but unwillingly making your way towards the original destination. But that's not the only valid reaction. Perhaps what you experience is a feeling of curiosity, and you eagerly keep walking forward, not frightened, but intrigued to find out what's around the corner. Perhaps the moment gave you an exciting jolt of adrenaline, an acute scare that startled you, but not a lasting fear that makes you too uneasy to move forward. Or perhaps this is the 10th time in 4 hours the game has tried to pull this same jump scare on you, so you hold down the run button and move even faster towards the end of the hallway, frustrated that your video game persona arbitrarily can't do anything to fight back against some invincible generic enemy waiting for you in the next room. Almost every horror game will contain examples like this, but their effectiveness relies on the context and the substance surrounding these moments. When a game banks exclusively on jump scares and shocking imagery for its value proposition, it's only ever going to be effective for the population of players who are truly and consistently frightened by those things. For the rest of us, those games become dull, repetitive, and annoying. This is always so disappointing to me because despite not often experiencing the visceral reactions associated with horror games, there's still a part of me that finds them incredibly intriguing. And this is because a lot of the tonal elements that are consistent with horror games also result in some really cool things that are independent of being scary. Unique and often bizarre art direction, punchy and amplified sound design, deliberate pacing coupled with thrilling set pieces. Horror games seem to be one of the genres in which developers feel like they have the freedom to take these design elements and just run with them. And with a solid enough foundation, some of these horror genre byproducts can certainly do a lot for a game even when it doesn't achieve its goal of frightening the player. But isn't frightening the player at least part of the goal of most of these games? Do horror games need to be scary to be good? Or is it enough to rely on some of these other elements to carry the game by facilitating related emotions like uneasiness, tension, and psychological fuckery? Well, it's time to wade through these questions and more. Time to dive in and time to cut through the meat of this argument. One of the most valuable steps a horror game can take is to determine upfront where it wants to land on the scariness spectrum. Identify your place between, I exist solely to freak people out, and I guess it'd be cool if they were space zombies. Because despite horror games having some pretty universal themes and starting points, it's actually a very difficult group to nail down as a genre. As you'll watch throughout the course of this video, we'll pull footage and examples from first-person adventures, side-scrolling puzzlers, over-the-shoulder action games, ghost-sucking Mario spin-offs, and they all contain and explore elements of horror and fear. On one end of the spectrum, you have more traditional, true horror games, like the Outlast series or the original Resident Evil games. Whether they succeed at it or not, these games are designed to be relentlessly scary, not only providing individual shocking moments, but also keeping the player in a state of tension throughout basically the entire playthrough. On the other side, you have titles like Dead Space and f.e.a.r, action games that happen to take place within a horror-based narrative. The developers hope to scare you here, sure, but their success hinges much more on engaging combat encounters and other active gameplay sequences. Then you have games that are born on this line but end up jutting off into something different altogether, like Telltale's The Walking Dead series, which definitely contains some frightening content, but the part of the game that provides the most tension is the decisions you're forced to make throughout it. It doesn't stop with those options though, because horror themes are also used frequently in games that have no greater intention of exploring them, instead using them as a pacing device to introduce a fresh chapter that breaks up the game's standard gameplay, environments, or tone. The most famous instance of this is probably the Ravenholm area of Half-Life 2, a pretty stark example of a tonal shift in a game that can already be pretty creepy. But even smaller scenes like the graveyard area in Ocarina of Time can achieve this same effect. In fact, Zelda games have consistently delivered some weird, paranormal, offbeat moments, and the developers have never shied away from playing around with themes of absurdity and the unknown. The Legend of Zelda is not a horror series by any means, but Nintendo has identified exactly how much of these elements to inject into the games to add just the right amount of creepiness, and over the years they've confidently sewn this into the fabric of the franchise. Many other games use horror themes simply as a backdrop. It's a coat of paint that seeps into the setting and the narrative seen in games like BioShock or Prey. These games don't need to be scary to succeed. It's not even really one of the primary objectives. But the way they choose to weave eerie environments and uneasy moments into the infrastructure of the game certainly strengthens the bigger picture. Limbo, for example, could have taken place in a brightly detailed outdoor environment, and the game's puzzles still would have been fun. But I'd certainly argue the game is better for instead choosing to implement the black and white silhouetted forests and factories that we ended up getting because of how the tone set by these environments interacts with Limbo's narrative and gameplay. Interestingly, in Limbo's successor, Inside, that concept starts to blur a bit. This game is so much about exploring deeper and deeper into its unnerving and twisted world that it feels like those elements need to be there. In this case, the art design and the aesthetic become a necessity rather than just an enhancement. There's just so many varying methods and degrees with which games can utilize their horror themes, some relying on them more as a key feature, and others using them simply as one piece of the puzzle. But I think it's extremely important to identify this up front, then play to the strengths of what that method can provide. For example, first-person, environmentally driven horror games typically offer little in the way of interactive gameplay, instead choosing to deliberately guide the player along a chosen path. Because of this, they usually work best as concise, focused experiences that continually keep things fresh. There's not often much for the player to do in this format, so they need to consistently be presented with new things to see and hear. It makes sense then that these games' greatest enemies are not psychopath cult members or shadowy poltergeists, but instead the presence of monotony, staleness, and overstaying their welcome. Which brings us to our next point. Outlast has one hell of an onboarding sequence. The entire setup of your character arriving at and breaking into this asylum, the mood that's set within the first few minutes you spend there, the soundscape that follows you and alarms you along the way, it's all really well done. And based on this first impression, Outlast feels like a game that's brimming with atmospheric potential. But soon after this introduction sequence, it becomes apparent that the fascinating atmosphere that Outlast builds its foundation on doesn't really go anywhere from there. Throughout the rest of the playthrough, you'll find yourself running through the same hallways, hiding under the same beds, and helplessly running away from the same enemies. The tone that was set so skillfully at the start of the game quickly devolves into one that looks and feels repetitive, and instead of reinventing itself, it continues to lean heavily into shock value and grotesqueness as a way to keep the player interested. The game's sequel improves on some of the atmospheric repetition, this time introducing much more varied environments and areas, but it sticks to the exact same run and hide gameplay sequences that became so stale in the first game. Contrast this to Layers of Fear, a haunted house-style game that makes its living on continuously finding new ways to stay relevant. Layers of Fear specializes in psychologically messing with the player, constantly contorting reality in different ways, and for the most part, the developers find creative methods to do this. One of the main criticisms of this game is that after a while you can start to predict when these moments are going to happen, which is true. But it's unlikely you'll predict exactly what is going to happen, as it's pretty rare for the game to repeat the exact same scare, distortion effect, or environmental flip. But admittedly, it would be difficult even for the creative minds at work here to keep this type of momentum up. So they made another decision that works in the game's favor. It's short. I'm of the opinion that a lot of games, regardless of genre, tend to overstay their welcome, but this is especially true in horror games. Even a game like Dead Space, which provides a proper good time slicing necromorphs to pieces with interesting weaponry, feels like it lasted a couple more chapters than it should have. But this problem is magnified even further when you take horror games that are already limited in engaging gameplay features, making games like Alien Isolation an unfortunate victim of this flaw. The first couple of times you encounter the game's titular enemy and frantically find a place to hide while having no choice but to listen to its footsteps as it stalks around you can be pretty thrilling. But then when you're forced to do this again and again and again, it pretty quickly becomes an annoyance, one that's made worse by the sheer length of the game. I think Alien Isolation could have been stellar if it had been a dense, thrilling 6 to 8 hour experience that focused on the things it does well. But instead, it became a visually repetitive, slowly paced campaign that dragged on much longer than it needed to. That visually repetitive piece is important because of all the pitfalls that horror games can succumb to, this seems to be the most frequent. The horror genre, at least traditionally, is almost inherently limited by certain artistic qualities. Although settings can vary pretty widely, things are almost always dark, feature muted color palettes, and rarely deviate with brighter art design. Lighting is dramatic, often intentionally unrealistic, highlighting certain areas while leaving adjacent spaces pitch black. Because of the constant need for darkness, horror games most often take place at night, entirely indoors, or both. It's not impossible to break free from these chains to create some great-looking environments, but it certainly can make it harder on artists to do so. Even a game as polished and well-made as Resident Evil 2 can begin to feel a little fatiguing when the player is persistently hit with the status quo horror aesthetic. This makes games like Oxenfree and Luigi's Mansion, with their cartoony, non-traditional art styles, feel even more refreshing in a genre full of sameness. But of course, no amount of visual variety, quality pacing, or creative ways to bring the scares is going to matter a whole lot when a developer forgets why people are playing their game in the first place. Dead Space has a huge fanbase that loves the game, and many consider it to be a pillar of the horror genre. There's a reason this game is receiving a pretty intensive remake set to release next year. And although it has some startling moments and a creepy atmosphere, truthfully the scariest thing about it is the main character's posture. Yikes, Isaac. But Dead Space is not considered a classic because it's scary, it's considered a classic because it's freaking cool, and its main gameplay feature, the combat, is a lot of fun. Its frightening elements, like Bioshock, like Limbo, without a doubt add to the experience, but they're not the primary factor behind its success. f.e.a.r is another game that I previously mentioned in line with Dead Space. The combat here is far and away the best part of f.e.a.r, with its devastating weapons and its slow motion capabilities, leading to some outlandishly entertaining sequences. But the game's horror elements leave a lot to be desired, relying heavily on cheap jump scares, an uninteresting antagonist, and a nonsensical story, even for a paranormal setting. So while Dead Space is a fun game that's enhanced by its horror themes, f.e.a.r is a game that gets away with its horror themes because it's a fun game. We see this often where games will try to force their scariness onto the player, but oftentimes it ends up coming at the expense of the player's enjoyment. Remember the hide from the alien sequences in Alien Isolation? Well, this is not a problem that's unique to that game. In fact, the invincible or overpowered enemy archetype is a common theme in plenty of horror games, with some of them implementing the idea better than others. Resident Evil 2, a fantastic remake that nails the balance between scary and fun, uses this concept with its tyrant enemy. And although I like pretty much every other aspect of this game, I do not like the tyrant. I think it's a needlessly stressful mechanic that turns the game from being a spooky, calculated old-school adventure into a series of frantic running episodes that takes control away from you at seemingly the most inopportune times. This one enemy changes the entire DNA of the game.
Something tells me he's not a cop.
However, I do appreciate the fact that you can at least attack and stun the enemy if you want to, similar to Dead Space's hunter foe, giving you time to find your bearings and run away to a place of safety. Meanwhile, in Outlast, I'm over here jumping out of lockers and shit and can't even attempt to push this guy out of the way. Prey's variation of this is the nightmare enemy, which, although very dangerous, is not invincible. So the game gives the player a choice: run or fight. If you choose to run and are able to hide from the nightmare for a certain period of time, it will leave you alone. For a while. If you choose to fight, you can defeat the nightmare and it will disappear. For a while. But the most important part of this is that both options are valid, and the game keeps the decision within the player's control. It's not a secret that taking control away from the player is a very risky maneuver in games. Having control over what happens to you or your character is the very thing that makes games unique to other mediums of entertainment. And when you take that control away, you're constantly tiptoeing the line of creating a frustrating moment. We see the ramifications of this all the time. It's why the developers at Blizzard removed most of the stun abilities in Overwatch when they launched its sequel. It's why the squid ink for Mario Kart is the absolute worst item in gaming history. Why is this still a thing? No one thinks this is fun. There's endless evidence of this being frustrating for players, but horror games just can't help themselves when it comes to vanquishing all control a player may normally have. The intention, of course, is that by limiting a player's control, it creates a greater sense of fear, just as it would in real life. Not to mention, it allows developers to script the game to play out exactly as they want it to, exposing the player to every scare the way it was envisioned. Unfortunately, this technique usually backfires, and instead causes the player to be annoyed with the game, removing them from their sense of immersion and any hope of truly scaring them. It's a textbook example of developers sacrificing the player's enjoyment for what they envision the game to be. It ignores the fact that at their core, games should still be built to have fun. Now listen, I don't think every horror game needs to be Dead Space any more than I think every adventure game needs to be Breath of the Wild. I love and encourage games that set out to do something different or focus on doing one thing really well, like telling a compelling story, creating an interesting world, or implementing a unique mechanic. But the games that are able to accomplish this and succeed are the ones that don't get bogged down with other unnecessary components. They focus on their goal and stay out of their own way. The Walking Dead is a point-and-click narrative game that's deepest gameplay feature is figuring out that you need batteries to turn a radio on.
There are no batteries in this thing.
But it provides such a suspenseful story that's delivered with such emphasis on tough player choices that it becomes an incredibly compelling experience. And its infrequent action sequences are simple, brief, and frankly difficult to fail at. It knows what it is, and it stays out of its own way. This is why it's frustrating to come across continuous chase sequences in Outlast, or subpar combat encounters in Alan Wake, or some goofy, uninspiring enemy in f.e.a.r. They don't need to be there, and the games would almost certainly be better off without them altogether. So if you're given a choice, err on the side of making things enjoyable, then use the horror themes as a method for enhancing that enjoyment. I think one of my favorite parts about making this video is the fact that pretty much none of the points I've been arguing mean anything if you are simply the type of person that is physiologically frightened by games. Because if that's you, and you enjoy the experience of being scared, that emotion is going to top pretty much every other design choice a developer can make. That's how powerful it is. Like, I know I haven't been too kind to Outlast for the last 20 minutes, but this is a game that has an overwhelmingly positive rating on Steam. It's clearly doing a lot of things right for a lot of people. f.e.a.r is another game that, to me, feels almost comical at times with the way it attempts to scare the player.
Oh god, they're dead. They're all dead.
But this game is a cult classic with a following that loves the fact that it's a horror game. But if you're not one of those people, and you're seeking a more balanced, enjoyable experience, hopefully it's clear now that there are a lot of adjustments developers can make to create quality horror games that don't need to rely on their ability to scare the player. And there are numerous examples of games that are already doing this. Do horror games need to be scary to be good? Of course not. There's so many other components they can focus on that still result in an entertaining experience. And I would argue that a lot of games should probably focus more on these components rather than putting so much effort into attempting to scare the player. But I can also tell you that plenty of games are enhanced by themes of fear. Plenty of worlds are broadened through feelings of fright. And even when you're not expecting it, the perception of scariness can leave a long and lasting impression.
I can try to find some. Needs two.
Thanks. I wouldn't even really know what to look for.
Wait, you don't know what batteries are? So this video was a lot of fun to make, and there's so much to talk about here that I ended up leaving a lot of content on the cutting room floor. We didn't even dive into genres like modern survival games with horror elements, or anything about the abundance of multiplayer horror games flooding the market now. Not to mention the world of weird and wonderful indie horror titles that bring so many fresh ideas in non-traditional ways. So if you enjoyed what you saw here and want to hear more about these topics and many others, do me a favor and like this video, subscribe if you're really into this stuff, and leave me a comment about what your favorite horror game is and why. Or one just yelling at me for the fact that I've never played any of the Silent Hill games.